have been discussing yesterday, and just to add some one or two points. As far as the structure is concluded, see that we have the Ministry of Congress and Protection, and we have the General Council, which serves our and the General Goods Council, Services Council, and the Troops Council. And of course, for each of them, we have different committees on the specific matters that each of those committees would deal with. So yes, what we have here is the representation at the ministerial level. So all countries, member countries of this institution, are represented at the ministerial conference. The ministerial conference meets once every 2 years. And as far as an additional point that we did not say yesterday is with regard to the mandates that are given to the ministerial conference. So the ministerial conference can make a decision on every matter that comes or that's brought to its attention by the member countries, by the General Council, or by each of the respective councils here. So ultimate decision making lies, we can say, on the ministerial conference. But specifically, some important powers or mandates that the ministerial conference has includes one, authoritative interpretation of the agreement, the Marrakesh Agreement itself, plus the end of the agreement. There's a difference between interpreting a law and giving authoritative interpretation of a law. As a dispute settlement body, the General Council, for example, when you have an appellate body, the appellate body, or even the panel, one of the things that it does is interpret the provisions of one of the agreements that are being questioned. But the type of interpretation that we talk about in this settlement scenario and interpretation that we talk about here, which is as a mandate are different. In this scenario, where we are talking about interpretation of a provision of the sovereign WTO agreements in the case of dispute settlement, is that interpretation will bind only the parties to that particular case, because there is no surrogacy or there is no precedent system within the WTO settlement mechanism. So decision binds only parties to a particular dispute. So whatever interpretation is given to a provision would bind only the parties to the particular dispute. It doesn't go or it doesn't affect other member countries which are not parties to the particular dispute. But here, when we talk about authoritative interpretation, as per Article 9, paragraph 2 of the Marrakesh Agreement, we're talking about an interpretation of a provision which would bind every member of the WTO. So there's a big, obviously, as the name itself indicates, there's a difference between interpretation of the provisions of the agreement and authoritative interpretation of the agreement. So the ministerial conference, one of the powers that it has is giving an authoritative interpretation to provisions which are of the multilateral agreement or the Marrakesh Agreement itself, which are brought to attention by any interested organ. Could be the council, the different committee members, and so on and so on. Another mandate that the ministerial conference, well, actually this not only the ministerial conference, but it's kind of a joint power which is given to both the ministerial conference and the general council. Because Article 9, paragraph 2 says the ministerial conference and the general council shall have the exclusive authority to adopt interpretations of these agreements. End of the multilateral agreement. So those parties, well, of course, in effect, what will happen when the ministerial conference is in recess is the general council steps up and assumes the mandates of the ministerial conference. So it will only be logical to give the mandate to both organs. Another power that the ministerial conference has is what we have under Article 9, paragraph 3, which says, of course, in exceptional circumstances, the ministerial conference may set waiver obligation, granting of waivers. So those agreements that we talked about yesterday, the annexes, that's where we find substantive obligations of parties. But sometimes, in exceptional circumstances, the countries may seek for a waiver of an obligation, mandate for any one of those agreements. Like, for example, in the relationship between African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries on the one hand and European countries on the other hand, there is preferential treatment which the European countries were giving, or are giving, still giving to the former colonies, which are found in African, Pacific, and Caribbean countries. But through time, other countries which are not members of the ACP challenged this preferential treatment, saying that this is inconsistent to some of the obligations. Unless these European countries extend the same preference to our products, then we're put at a disadvantage, and there's no point of being a member of this institution unless those kinds of discriminations are done away with. So it was agreed that the preference given to these African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries are inconsistent with major principles of the trading system. So what happens is the WTO gave a waiver for the European countries to extend the preferential treatment for a certain period of time. So when countries request, this is an exceptional circumstance, that's not the whole, okay? So who makes the decision whether or not the European communities gets a waiver to preferentially treat its former colonies is the ministerial conference. Of course, in its absence, that can automatically be assumed in the General Council. So another power or important mandate given to the ministerial conference is granting waiver to countries. Granting waiver so that those, in exceptional circumstances, those countries would not observe their obligation emanating from any one of those, any one of the agreements. Another one is adopting amendments. Amendment to the Marrakesh Agreement itself and to any one of the multilateral agreements. Article 10 of the Marrakesh Agreement says, any member of the WTO may initiate a proposal to amend the provisions of this agreement or the multilateral trade agreements in Annex 1 by submitting such proposal to the ministerial conference. So the proposal to the amendment of any one of the agreements must be submitted to the ministerial conference, and of course it's the ministerial conference which will decide on the amendment of any provision of the WTO agreements. Another mandate given to the ministerial conference again is, we've mentioned that the survey making a decision on the accession of member countries. The accession process normally takes a long period of time, but when it's finalized, then a decision has to be made. When all the processes which are expected of the applicant country are finalized, then the decision would be made by the ministerial conference whether to accept that applicant country to join the club or not. Another thing is appointment of the Director General of the WTO. You have that under Article 6 paragraph 2, the Ministerial Conference shall appoint the Director General and adopt regulations setting out the powers, duties, conditions of service, and term of office of the Director General. So the DG of the WTO is to be appointed by the Ministerial Conference, and the rules and procedures, the conditions, what duties would the Director General assume, and so on, are something to be provided to by the Ministerial Conference. And then you have the General Council, again, which is also composed of all members of this institution. That while the General Council, when the Ministerial Conference is in recess, assumes the responsibilities, the mandates, and so on of the Ministerial Conference, there are at least two specific duties which are, or mandates which are specifically given to the General Council. One is with regard to the annual budget. Annual budget of the WTO. It's going to be adopted by this is the General Council. So you find that under Article 7 of the Marrakesh Agreement. It's a very long sentence. The last one says the annual budget estimate shall be subject to approval by the General Council. So it's a mandate given to the General Council, which is not going to be shared by the Ministerial Conference. Another mandate which is specifically given to the General Council is cooperation with international organizations and non-governmental organizations. Article 5, cooperation. The General Council shall make appropriate arrangements for effective cooperation with other intergovernmental organizations that have responsibilities related to those of the WTO. The General Council may make appropriate arrangements for consultation and cooperation with non-governmental organizations concerning these matters related to those of the WTO. So in addition to the WTO, there are other intergovernmental organizations that work on trade matters. Like we have the World Bank, there is the IMF, maybe the UNCTAD as well. Those are intergovernmental organizations which also work on trade matters. So they have either direct or indirect involvement in trade policy formulation of their member countries. So a country may be both a member of the World Bank and the WTO, or the IMF and the WTO. So if there is no policy coherence between these institutions in terms of the policy formulation of the member countries, then it's going to be difficult for the member countries to comply with either of the requirements of either of those institutions. So one way of ensuring that there exists coherence in policy formulation is that there should be cooperation between the different intergovernmental organizations which are involved in economic policy formulations of the member countries. So that's where the General Council plays a role in creating some kind of connection with those international intergovernmental organizations. So what happens is those organizations would have a permanent seat in the WTO, so representatives from those organizations would sit and listen to what was being discussed by the party, by the member countries in tariff negotiations or any other negotiations. It works both ways. Representatives from the WTO would also be allowed to sit in meetings of the other intergovernmental organizations. That way, at least they would have an understanding or a knowledge of what's being said and what's being going to happen in terms of policy formulations. So these are specifically the functions or the mandates rather of the General Council given to it. With regard to those, the first that we've seen on with the Ministerial Conference, like making authoritative interpretation and so on, those things need decision decision making. So yes, the initial conference can make a decision on those things. And an important question that arises is, how is the decision making process conducted here? Yes, we've touched upon it yesterday that the practice of the consensus decision making process of the GATT era passes over to the current system, or to the WTO. So specifically on that, we have Article 9, which says that the WTO shall continue the practice of decision making by consensus followed under the GATT 1957. So in normal circumstances, as much as possible, decisions are going to be made on a consensus base. But in some exceptional circumstances, if it's not possible to reach to a consensus, of course, there is the legal framework on the basis of which votes can be casted. So if you remember from the video clip yesterday, the guy was saying time and again that the WTO is a democratic institution and so on and so on. One of the reflections of this concept is that each country has equal vote. One country has one vote. So it doesn't matter whether the country is a very poor country like Ethiopia or a powerful country like the US. They all count as the same, or as equal countries. They have one vote. This is different from at least the way the IMF functions, where the contribution of the countries determines the number of votes that the countries will have. The financial contribution that they made affects the number of votes that the countries will have. But the case is different in the case of the WTO, where each member has one vote. So one member, one vote. Then, so we have to look at each of the issues. In most circumstances, the required number is like 3/4 majority vote. But of course, we have to be sure to know the specifics, and we have to look at the specific matter in question. Like, for example, in the case of amendments, yes, in normal course, if there is consensus, well and good. If there is no consensus, then it would be at least there should be 3/4 majority vote in favor of adopting an amendment to a particular provision. But then there are some exceptions where it's not possible even to talk about majority or casting a vote. Like, for example, Article 9 of this agreement itself, the Marrakesh Agreement, which talks about decision making. How Article 9 says decision making, it lists the rules on how a decision making process is going to be conducted. So if you want to amend that provision, then you need to have a consensus of everyone. Okay. Then amendment again on Article 1 and 2 of the GATT agreement, which talk about the principles, the fundamental principles. Yeah. Article 2, paragraph 1 of the GATT, Article 4 of the TRIPS agreement. So we have those 4 things which are selected, specifically mentioned in this the amendment provision of the Marrakesh Agreement, which says that, yes, as much as possible, Article 9 applies, which is consensus decision making. But if consensus cannot be reached, then yes, you can vote even in amending the relevant provisions, provisions. But when you in casting a vote, the required vote, you need is 3/4 majority. But in those 4 issues, in Article 9 of the agreement itself, and with regard to Article 1 and 2 of the GATT agreement, with regard to Article 2 of the Services Agreement, and Article 4 of the Intellectual Property Agreement, there needs to be a consensus, because as an exception, class can only upon acceptance by all members. So, to talk about the decision-making process, we need to know what, in terms of what we're talking about, and then we have to look at the specifics here. Same also for accession. We need to have 3/4 majority. I mean, consensus, preferably. If consensus cannot be reached, 3/4 majority. So these are just some of the things that we did not see yesterday. If you have any questions, yes. And I haven't seen any legal provision which prohibits it from doing so. But when you look at how it is being practiced, the General Council does not appoint its own Director General. Yes, legally it's possible. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't prohibit it, or it doesn't say only the Ministerial Conference can do that. It just simply give the power, the mandate to the Ministerial Conference to exercise those things. And then somewhere you find provision which says the General Council assumes the mandates of the Ministerial Conference when the Ministerial Conference. If you say that one of those things can be done only by the Ministerial Conference, what you're going to say is like the Ministerial Conference meets once in 2 years. So probably after the 6 months of its meeting, the Director General probably passed away or left the position for any unknown number of reasons. So what we're going to say is we have to wait until for the next meeting, which is going to happen after a year and a half. But then there are some important day-to-day decisions that the Director General is expected to make in between those times. So I would assume in such circumstances it can be exercised by that. But with regard to those things which are given to the General Council, there is no way it goes back to the applicant to the Minister. Any question? Let's skip to the next topic in our course outline, which is the principles of the trading, the substantive principles of the trading system. From those substantive principles, basically we'll focus on 2 of them, which is principle of non-discrimination and the market access principle. The non-discrimination principle, basically what it says is that we need to treat products emanating from, like products of course, coming from or destined to member countries in a similar manner. So if we extend any advantage to a product coming from country X, then that similar treatment or that similar advantage must be extended to the product coming from another member country. The principle of non-discrimination applies not just with regard to products coming from 2 countries, but rather it also extends to a product which is domestically produced with a product that is a like product that is imported. This non-discrimination principle has been always recognized as the cornerstone of the multilateral trading system. You find it in the gas agreement, in the services agreement, in the TRIPS agreement, almost you find it in all of the agreements that are included under this institution. And I mean, that happens to be the basis or the main, the basis for the countries in their trading activities. So as this non-discrimination principle has 2 kinds or 2 layers. One is what we call the most favored nation, and the other is the national treatment. With regard to the most favored nation treatment, the requirement is to treat in a similar manner 2 like products which either originate or destined from 2 different countries. Whereas the comparison in the case of national treatment is between a domestic product and imported product. Here the comparison is with regard to both imported products, but the origin of the product, or and the origin of the product will be two different countries. Let's first look at the independent principle, and then we'll proceed to the national treatment. So for the discussion from now on, you need to have the GATT agreement. ተሰጥቷችኋል GATT agreement? የሆነ ፒንክ ከቨር ያለው ቀጭን ትራንስፈርታችሁ አመት ስትመዘገቡ ዲስሊ ሶስት ኮፒ ልኬላችኋለሁ። ላስት ታይም ከላኩት ውስጥ ነው ኖርማሊ ሰጥ ነበረ። So Article 1, it's a very long provision. At least we can look at two parts. With respect to customs duties and charges of any kind imposed on or in connection with importation or exportation, or imposed on the international transfer of payments for imports or exports, and with respect to the method of levying such duties and charges, and with respect to all rules and formalities in connection with the importation and exportation, and with respect to all matters referred to in paragraph 24 of Article 3. So let's say this is just one part, or the first part of the provision. And then comes a second part, which says any advantage, favor, privilege, or immunity which is granted by any member to any product originating in or destined for any other country shall be accorded immediately and unconditionally to the like product originating in or destined for the territories of all other members. All other community members. So you have at least 4 elements that are of importance for our discussion for this provision, particularly the second part of the provision. You have this advantage. It starts by saying any advantage, privilege, and so on. Any advantage, favor, privilege. And then you have any advantage which is originating or in or destined for any other country, like product, to the like product originating in or immediately and unconditionally to all other countries. So you have any advantage, like products, to any country, and then you have unconditional. It must be unconditionally and immediately. Immediate and unconditional provision of whatever advantage, privilege that you give to one, to a product originating from one country must be extended immediately and unconditionally to a like product originating or destined to another. So each of those elements will become clear the more we progress on this lesson. This aspect of the non-discrimination principle has been there, as you can see from the during the GATT period, where we have the 1947 agreement. And of course, there were different reasons which were proposed by the negotiating parties back then as to why they need to have the most favored nation clause as one of the fundamental or cornerstone principles of the trading system. There was the belief that if each of the countries observe this principle, observe the principle of non-discrimination, particularly the MFN aspect of the non-discrimination principle, there was the belief that every country will benefit in the long run. Because what you do by treating like products in a like manner is you're favoring the more efficient producers. If you are treating products in a different manner, in a discriminatory manner, if you're, for example, if you allow some products to be imported to your territories without the payment of tariff, whereas the like product which comes from another country is subjected to a particular tariff, what you are doing is you're shielding the product from the other country. But efficiently speaking, the producers in the second country can produce more products efficiently, and I mean that means they can have the effect of depressing their price, which would be very good for the consumers in the importing country. So the underlying understanding is that in the long run, when every country accepts or implements this non-discrimination principle, in the long run everyone benefits, because we are somehow enhancing the more efficient or helping the more efficient producers to have access to the market. So, as I mentioned, this issue of including the non-discrimination, particularly in the MFN principle, as a basic principle, was a point of discussion among economists during at the time of negotiating the GATT agreement in 1997. So they tried to show certain viewpoints as to why it's important to treat all products like products, so long as they are like in a like manner. One is the thing that I've said, like that it will allow countries to satisfy their import needs from the most efficient producer. So it allows or gives the room for efficiency. Remember when we talk about the reason behind countries trade and so on, we've talked about comparative advantage being the reason as to why countries should trade with each other. That argument can again apply here in the sense that when you treat like products in like coming from different countries in a like manner, you're going to import from the efficient producers from the efficient countries. So it would be comparatively advantageous for you to treat all products in a similar in a like manner, so long as the products are like products. That way you give room for efficiency. And then the other point of view that was looked into was from the point of view of trade policy making. When you require that like products should be treated in a like manner, the way this like treatment is reached. For example, if we're talking about, it says any advantage, so we can talk about a number of advantages. But let's just limit ourselves to tariff, for example. How is, so you have country A importing, let's say, coffee from country B, country C, and country D. Let's assume coffee from everywhere is the same. Meaning that it's like a product. So, A imports coffee from all three countries. In its bilateral negotiation, A has agreed to impose a tariff of 10% ad valorem on coffee that comes from B. Whereas the bilateral negotiation between A and C leads for 9% ad valorem on coffee that comes from C. Whereas for coffee coming from D, the agreement they reached was 15%. So, which country is advantaged now? C. Because country C managed for different reasons. It could be because the negotiators of country C were very good ones, convincing country A to lower its tariff to a particular point. Or maybe country A has another interest in exporting its products to country C, a product which the market does not demand in country B. So for a number of reasons could contribute for such a difference in outcome of the negotiation. So when you talk about this in terms of the MFN principle or in terms of Article 1, what we're saying is any advantage, any favor that you give to country C must immediately and unconditionally be extended to B and D. So, irrespective of the outcome, the tariff for coffee to be imposed by country A would be 9%, whether the coffee comes from B, C, or D. Because what Article 1 says is any advantage, privilege, which is given to one product must immediately and unconditionally be extended to others. So looking at it from a trade point of view, what they have proposed, or what they have said is requiring this kind of thing, saying imposing this non-discrimination principle would enable in protecting the value of the bilateral concessions. Unless there is a way in which country A would be required to extend similar treatment, whatever favor that it gives to one to another one, the value that's going to be reached, there's not going to be any point in C or in any other country to engage in meaningful kind of tariff negotiation with them. So one way of ensuring the value of those bilateral concessions is imposing or requiring that whatever favor is given to one would be expanded to the others. Of course, doing that would also spread the security of with trade, or with non-discrimination, everyone would benefit. But if we are allowed to discriminate, then we'll threaten the security of the trading system. That's the kind of argument that we give some kind of value to the bilateral negotiation or to the concessions that are going to be reached. That way we can secure, or we can say that the negotiations lead to some kind of security to the trading system. They try also to look at it from the point of view of politics. Like, let's say country B is a developed country. Country C is, again, no, it would make sense if this one was an ADC and this one is a developed. This one also an ADC. So when you say whatever preferential treatment, whatever arrangement or advantage that you give to C, which is a developed country, must be extended immediately to B and D, who are developing countries, or LDCs, least developed countries. What you're saying is everyone would be considered as equal, irrespective of the financial capacity, the economic status of the countries. So long as the products are like products, so long as we're talking about the same product, then wherever it originates, it must be treated equally, because that's the politically correct thing to do. If we discriminate, it can have a political implication that we're saying that we are going to favor only the developed countries, but countries which are poor would not be treated in a similar manner. So they say that it would be the politically correct thing to do, to treat products like products. Okay, there are some certain kind of phrases to treat them in a like manner. Again, also it guarantees some kind of equality for newcomers as well. Let's say So this were B, C, D were members, the contracting parties, so they become automatically original members of the WTO. And then we have Ethiopia. Let's assume we finished the accession process in 2020, 22, sorry, 2 years ago. So let's say we finalized the accession process in 2022. Mind you, those countries, B, C, and D, have been there for the past, I don't know, since 1995, in 25 or so years. Then a newcomer country would still face the same amount of tariff if it exports the like product to country A. So a country which joins this year in 2020 exports coffee to country A, it would still have to pay, the importers would still have to pay the 9% import tax. So the products, whether you are an original member of the WTO or you are a late comer to this club, would still be subject to the same advantage, the same tariff. So it guarantees a kind of unequal access or opportunity to the newcomers to the market of those countries. Another, again, also from the political point of view, I mean from the internet or domestic point of view, it would be difficult to administer when you have multiple tariff headings for a single product. So you have to check, is this coffee coming from B? If it is from B, then you tax tariff 10%. Is it coming from D? Then it's 15%. Is it coming from, well, we have at least within the WTO 164. So if you're going to maintain that kind of difference, it would be challenging from the point of view of the importing country itself domestically to administer the tariff. So they've mentioned different reasons as to why we need to have this non-discrimination principle, particularly the MFN aspect. So they have agreed in 1947. They were convinced that by looking into those agreements, those proposals, they were convinced that the MFN should be made part of the principle which governs the system. Of course, this is not a new thing. Okay? The MFN, it's not new for the GATT agreement. Before, if you look into agreements which were concluded before the 1947 agreement, like the Friendship, Navigation and Commerce agreements, which were normally concluded by between the US and its trading partners, it contained MFN provision, where the US agreed to treat traders coming from the different territories trade partners in a similar manner. But one of the differences in the MFN clauses of the Friend Navigation and Commerce agreements and the GATT agreement is the conditionality. Here, what is required is you cannot attach any condition. Earlier, the US used to attach different conditions, mainly reciprocity as a condition. It may impose a reciprocity as a condition, meaning that I will treat your traders in a particular manner, provided you treat mine in such a manner. But when you allow the attachment of a condition to such treatments, one of the dangers is that you cannot have control over the type of conditions that can be imposed by the particular. But if it's that country says, okay, I will allow your products a similar kind of treatment with the products of C, provided you make sure that Mr. X becomes your next president, or make sure that you dispose of your presidents. So that's the danger of giving a room for attaching a condition in extending the favorable treatment to different trade partners. So what we have under the current in the GATT agreement, as well as the other agreements, is an unconditional. You cannot attach any condition in the treatment, in the privilege that you give to countries. Reciprocity will come to, I mean, it's embedded in another principle when you talk about the principle with regard to market access. One of the important principles there is reciprocity. Okay, so let's forget reciprocity. Other than reciprocity, we can talk about other conditions in addition to, or because reciprocity is a fundamental thing within the how is it interpreted? It's always questionable, but there is understanding that reciprocity is a fundamental thing in the tariff negotiation. So we can talk about other conditions.
Yes, what is your
very good? Then, so let's say A would allow the 9% tariff for coffee from C, but then it says provided or as part of the reciprocal way in the tariff negotiation, they have said that there will be 5 companies in C from A, which would allow to operate there. So the question is, that kind of reciprocity is part of the way the tariff negotiation was handled. When A is required to extend to D, it's not saying, it's not adding additional condition. Okay. If there was no condition attached on C, but say when it comes to B, okay, I will give you the same kind of treatment as I gave to C, but you have to do this and this, something additional. That's when we say we're attaching a condition. That we're saying that C and D are being treated differently because the treatment or the privilege which is given to C is given to D, provided D fulfills certain things where we did not require C to fulfill something. That's when we what's being meant here when we say unconditional. But this issue of unconditionality in some is not that much of a contentious issue. But rather, what's contentious is how do we know when products are like products? Before we go there, let's just see any advantage, because this is the first element in this second part of this provision. It is an advantage, favor, privilege, or immunity which is granted. So yes, we've talked about tariff, but in addition to tariff, there are number of privileges, number of advantages that a country can give to a country. It may even relate to the manner of collecting the tariff, how you collect the tariff, the timing of collecting the tariff. Could discriminate between products on the basis of the origin of products. So maybe if you require to collect the VAT, for example, the VAT, at the time of importation for products that come from C, but the timing for requesting the payment of VAT for a product that emanates from B is after the sale of the product. Are we treating the product in a like manner? ለምሳሌ እቃ ኢምፖርት ሲደረግ የሚከፈሉ ነገሮች አሉ አይደል? ታሪፍ ይከፈላል። ታሪፍ ላይ ታስቦ VAT ይከፈላል። አሉ ዲፍረንት ታክስ ሎ ተማርኩ ታክስ ሎ ላይ የተቀመጡት ነገሮች አሉ። አንድ እቃ ስናስገባ የሚከፈለው ማለት ነው ታሪፍ አለ። ታሪፉ ላይ ደግሞ ተጨምሮ ሶርት ታክስ አለ፣ ቫልዩ አድድ ታክስ አለ እና በውስጥ ይዛሉ የሚከፈሉ ማለት ነው። መቼ ነው ኮሌክት የሚደረጉት? ኖርማሊ ኢምፖርት አድራጊ ኢምፖርት ሲያደርግ ታክሱን ሲከፍል እያንዳንዱ at the time of importation ነው የሚከፍለው። It's not after the selling of the product that is አለብለው ማለት ነው። because በኋላ ላይ ኮሌክት ማድረጉ ከባድ ስለሆነ so the government collects the sales tax or the value added tax even before the product is sold. Let's say, yeah, impact ምንድን ነው የሚሆነው? بفلك نصعد هذا المنكفله ويلم بشرت نصعد هذا اللي هي اللي من قسم المنكفله I product بشرت كوالا متكفلين بتاعنا we're giving the trader kind of some kind of benefit عملوا كمان فلنا وحالا لا يقاوم بشرت كوالا ممكن ما ultimately كconsumer لا كل اللي تعمل غير مكفله قلت كمان بيتيون كفلسفنا لو we're asking the importer the trader to pay the VAT in advance before that person collects that from the consumer. So let's say if that is with regard to like if products that come from B, the importer have to pay that product at the time of importation, I mean the VAT for example. But with regard to product demanding from C, the trader can pay it after he or she has sold the product. If I were the trader, I would obviously favor importing from country C, even if the products are products. While I'm having at the time of importing the so comparison which one is beneficial? It's going to be beneficial. So the timing of collecting the tax can also be an advantage to one product demanding from one country. So the manner of collecting, if you look at the first sentence, the first part, it says with respect to the customs duties and charges of any kind imposed on or in connection with importation or exportation, or imposed on the international transfer of payments or imposed or exported. And with respect to the method of levying such duties, and duties and charges, with respect to the rules and formalities in connection with their importation and exportation. So when it says any advantage, any privilege, it's ranged like multiple things. It can be tariff, it can be with regard to other taxes. Not necessarily only tariff, but said salt tax is imposed at the time of importation of a particular product. But if the salt tax imposed on a product coming from B is different from countries C, we're saying that we're going to say that the two products are treated in a different manner. The lesser one favoring that product in particular. So any advantage, anything which treats one product favorably than the other. Amount to be time of collection of the tariff, the tax, and so on, the manner of collection, advantage supply, privilege supply for one product over another. So it's a very broad one. Any advantage, privilege, and so on. You can see that it's a very broad, any kind of the second element is discrimination is not allowed provided the products are like products. If the products are not like products, then there's no more, you can discriminate in any way you want. But if you're talking about like products, then that's where this requirement of treating the products in a like manner comes. So then the obvious question is, when do we say products are like products? So I have a word for marker and I have this classic. Are these two products like products? Obviously they're not. How about coffee? How about apples and orange? Is apple the same as orange? Based on what criteria do you say this product is not like this one? Let's stick to the apple and orange. Are they the same? Or I mean, like rather. Like natural apple and orange? Lemon. Like yellow lemon. There was this case in 1979. that was a bad time, but before it's about coffee. The case was between Brazil on the one hand and Spain on the other hand. The name of the case is the Spain unroasted coffee case. So what happened was, before 1979, Spain classified all of its unroasted, non-caffeinated coffee as under one category. Another one important thing is something that we will discuss when we come to the mathematics principle is countries are required to indicate the bound tariff. The bound tariff meaning the maximum amount of tariff that they would impose on a particular product. So under the current system, there's a requirement that all countries must bind their tariff on the products that they import. So they have to indicate that as well. Bind the maximum amount to product like maximum amount forecast አድርጎ ማስቀመጥ እና ማሳወቅ አለበት ማለት ነው። ኦፍ ኮርስ ከ1947 በፊት የዚህ አይነት ትሬንድ የለም። የዚህ አይነት ሪኳየርመንት የመጣው ከጋት ጋር ተያይዞ ነው። እንደገና ደግሞ ኢሚዲየትሊ አይደለም ሁሉም ሀገራቶች ታሪካቸውን ባይንድ አድርገው ያሳወቁት ማለት ነው። So that's an important element panel discussion ላይ የመጣ ወደ በኋላ ይስከራል። So in this case ከ1979 አውሮፓውያን አቆጣጠር ማለት ነው ስፔን ሁሉም unroasted ኮፊ በጠቅላላ ጥሬ ቡና ማለት ነው አንድ አይነት ታሪፍ እንግዲህ ነበረው። It's the same, it's treated as like product. So whether it comes from Brazil, from another, they were treated in the same way in terms of the tariff amount that they were imposed to. But in 1979, Spain introduced a new legislation, tarifing, which classified types of coffees into 5 different coffees. In the first 3, the unwashed Arabica, the Robusta, and other unwashed types. They introduced 7% to those 3 types of products. The unwashed Arabica, to the Robusta, and any other. And then to the Colombia mild and other mild. We have here Robusta and unwashed Arabica. Well, here the 3% tariff was introduced on the Colombia mild and other mild. But before that, the Spanish, the coffee was not bound under Article 2 of the data agreement. So of course, Brazil, as one of the exporters, major exporters of the unwashed Arabica to the Spain market, they complained, saying that there's a difference with regard to the amount of tariff that the coffee coming from Brazil faces while it's imported in Spain. 7%, whereas for the Colombia mild, 3%. So Spain was saying that, no, I make the classification based on factors like mildness and so on and so on. There's a difference in the taste, in the aroma of the coffee, called the Robusta and the Arabica, vis-a-vis the Colombian coffee. So I should be entitled to treat the coffees differently depending on the species. And then Brazil was arguing that, no, the difference in the aroma, in the taste and so on of the coffee is the result of the way of the agriculture mechanism that we use, the environment in which the coffee plants are planted. when the plants are planted at higher altitude, that contributes to a difference in taste of the product. So the way the agricultural system that they we also contributed to the difference. So basically what Brazil was saying is the difference in taste, in aroma and so on relates to the difference resulting from the geographical factors, the cultivation method, the processing of the beans, and the genetic factors as well. Those things the panel did not consider could contribute to the difference in this, but rather what the panel considered were certain facts, like the way the coffee was presented to the consumers at the end of the day. What happens then was that all coffee which was imported from different sources, from different countries, is roasted, ground, and made available to the consumers. So, but first of all, what they do, they blend the different coffees, or from the different coffee beans coming from different areas. So that means if you maintain this kind of difference or separation in your tariff line, but ultimately when you give it to the consumers, when it reaches the consumers, if you're presenting a blend of different kinds of coffee, then what's the point of making the distinction in the very beginning? So one of the factors that the panel looked into is, notice this kind of difference that you made didn't make sense, because ultimately one of the requirements that you put is when the coffee is reached to the consumers, it's reached in a blended form. ጥሬ ቡና ይገባና ከተለያየ ሶርስ ያ ጥሬ ቡና ተቆልቶ ተፈጭቶ ነው አቬለብል የሚሆነው ለኮንሱመር። ተቆልቶ ተፈጭቶ ስንል አልቲሜትሊ ተለያይቶ አልነበረም የሚቀርበው ለሰው ማለት ነው። አልቲሜትሊ ፎር ዘ ኮንሱመርስ ሲቀርብ። So the panel looked into this important factor. Yes, it's not unusual that the agricultural products would have difference in their aroma, in their taste, and so on, as a result of the factors like the geographical factors, the cultivation method that's going to be used, the processing of the beans, and so on, could contribute to the difference in the product. But the way the coffee is sold in Spain back then it was sold in a blended form. Even when it's sold unroasted, it's sold blended, meaning that whether it comes from Colombia or Brazil, it was sold like mixing it. So it said yes, there are certain things we need to look into to determine likeness of products. The first thing is the property. The property or the nature of the product in question. Meaning that the physical characteristics of the product. When you say the property, the nature, and so on, we're looking into the physical characteristics of the product. Is there a difference in the physical characteristics of the product? What is the end use of the product? That's the second thing, or the second element. What is the end use? For what purpose do the consumers of the product use that product? Ultimately, when consumers get that product, do they consider the one product to be substituted to the other? How is their perception? The taste of consumers. consumer sets, and of course habits. To the extent in which the consumers consider the products to be substitutable ones. You go to the cafeteria, you ask for a Coke, and you are told that there is no Coke. Do you automatically switch to Pepsi, or you say, okay, then I will not drink Coke or anything else? That's the perception of the consumers. Do you consider Coke and Pepsi to be substitutable products? If majority of the consumers consider them to be substitutable products, then it could mean that the two products are like products. Otherwise, you cannot consider them as like products just because they are soft drinks. Kind of thing. So we need to look into the property, the physical characteristics of the product. If there is likeness between the physical characteristics of the products, then we can, at least some degree, can say that the products are like. What are these products intended to be used for? The coffee is normally, it has a stimulating impact, whether it's a mild one or not, ultimately is a stimulant at the end of the day. The taste of consumers. Do consumers consider the products to be substitutable ones? Would whatever thing that we need from one product be available from the other? Let's look into those three things. In addition to that, the tariff classification of other countries. This fourth element is peculiar to the Spain and roasted coffee case because, as I mentioned earlier, before 1979, Spain did not classify its, did not have a different way of classification. Did not bind its tariff on coffee. So it looked into the experience of other countries. How did other countries classify the targeting of the product coffee? Do they make a similar kind of distinction? The trend showed that no. All countries, countries with parties to that agreement, categorize or consider coffee irrespective of the source, irrespective of whether it's Robusta, Arabica, or Colombia, to be like product, to be a coffee. So I think the panel held that coffee is the same. At least with regard to this particular case. Of course, it ተመለከታቸው እነዚህ ነገሮች ተመለከተ property physical. These are benchmarks, basically. This is the first time where this likeness of a product was interpreted under the GATT. So this benchmark is still being used, somehow developed to include more other things, but these are important benchmarks which were introduced back then in 1979 to distinguish the likeness of products. But coming to this particular case, in addition to considering those or introducing those benchmarks in determining the likeness of the product, as I said, it looked into the way that the product ultimately reached the consumers, that it was in a blend, that all coffee gathered from Brazil or Colombia or from other countries were blended before it was presented to the consumers. So, in effect, making it nonsense to keep that kind of difference in classification. But the other factors like this agricultural method of calculation in Sonia simply recognize them, but in this particular case, it did not include it as the reason for deciding that the products are like products. Difference አሙላሽ ታውላይ ልዩነት ሊያመጣ ይችላል. Yes, the way of cultivation ሊያመጣ ይችላል. ያንን እንላለን. Recognize that program in the format. Then important, this case is an important one because of the elements that it has introduced to differentiate between like products. Yes, it's all indicative function. Property physical characteristics ልንመለከት እንችላለን። በፊዚካል ካራክተሪስቲክ ቤዝ አድርገን ላይክ ነው አይደለም የሚለውን ልንወስድ እንችላለን። ኮንሱመሩ ለምንድን ነው የሚጠቀመው? ኢንዲዩዙ ለምንድን ነው? ጥም ለመቁረጥ ነው? ኦር ጫማ ነው ለማድረግ ነው? ኦር ዋቴቨር ዋት ኢዝ ዘ ኢንዲዩዝ የሚለው ሶ ኪሙሌቲቭሊ የምንመለከታቸው ነገሮች አይደሉም። ኤኒ ዋን ኦፍ ዶስ ኢሹስ ኦር ፋክተርስ ተመልክተን ፕሮዳክቶቹ ላይ ናቸው አይደለም የሚለው ኮንክሉዥን መርስ እንችላለን ማለት ነው። That's why I said it's a benchmark. ማለት like indication ነው ኢንዲኬተሮች ናቸው። ሰብስኩዌንት ፓነሎች ሰብስኩዌንት አፒሌት ቦዲስ ከተቋቋሙ በኋላ ምን አደረገ ስንል it followed those things. Not because they were buying it, but because it's convincing one. That's so the other element, the fourth one, is it says any country any other country, sorry. Any advantage, favor, privilege, or immunity granted by any member to any product originating in or destined from any other country. ማለት ለምሳሌ አራት አድቫንቴጅ አለ እንግዲህ ነው ኤ ቢ ያለን ሲ ያለን ዲ ያለን ማለት ነው። ሌትስ ሴይ ቢ እና ሲ የደብሊውቲኦ አባል ናቸው ያለ የጋዝ ኮንትራክቲንግ ፓርቲስ ነበሩ። ዲ ሌትስ ሴይ ኢዝ ነን ደብሊውቲኦ ነበር። So let's stick to coffee. Let's say, of course, the WTO abalatoች ስለሆኑ we have to treat them. Wait, let's go back to the first 9% አለን 10% አለን ከሲ የሚመጣውን ኮፊ and ከዲ የሚመጣውን ኮፊ which is a non-member of the WTO. Let's say it imposes a tariff of 5%. Advantage አለው A is importer of coffee from B, C, and D. Coffee from B 9%, from C 10%, from D 5%. Is there an advantage with regard to the tariff treatment of coffee? Yes. For coffee coming from D, it's a lesser amount of tariff that's what we impose. Second question: are the products like? They are like products. So then the next thing is, to whom is this privilege given or disadvantage given? To D, which is another WTO member. So any advantage, privilege, which is given to any other country must immediately and unconditionally be given to the member countries. The advantage, the privilege, which is given to D, which is a non-member, must be automatically granted to B and C, who are members of the, because A is also a member of the WTO. Let's change the scenario. What we have as an indication here is that, let's say the coffee originating from C is subject to 22% tariff, whereas from B and D, 9 and 5. B and C are WTO members, D is not a member of the WTO. So 2% is an advantage, lesser amount. Coffee is a like product. Coffee coming from B, C, and D is coffee is like product. So can B claim this 2%? Yes, because it's a member of the WTO. Can D claim this 2%? No, it cannot, because the requirement is to give whatever privilege, advantage that is given to any country, it must be extended to the member countries. There is no requirement or there is no condition that's required of you in terms of how you treat members of the WTO. They may have a bilateral agreement, so the bilateral agreement will sort it out. Okay, MFN treatment below bilateral ካስቀመጡ እሺ ሊኖር ይችላል። ከዛ በተረፈ the agreement lays an obligation, provides rights or privilege or whatever you call them to its members. So there's no requirement for C to extend the similar treatment, for A rather, to extend the same treatment to another member country. A privilege that it has given to the members of the WTO. It doesn't work that way. Requirement ምንድን ነው? ለማንኛውም ሀገር የተሰጠ ጥቅም አድቫንቴጅ ፕሪቪሌጅ ለአባል የሆነም ላልሆነም የሰጠነው ጥቅም ካለ አባል ለሆኑ ሀገራቶች ሁሉ ኤክስቴንድ መደረግ አለበት። አባል ያልሆነ ሀገር ፕሪቪሌጁን አድቫንቴጁን ልጠቀም ግን አይችልም። To do that, it must become a member of this institution. So any advantage, any privilege that you give to any other country, any member any contracting party any product originating or destined for any other country. Any other country even other than the members of the WTO. So if a country extends a benefit, an advantage to a non-member country, that privilege, that benefit must immediately and unconditionally be extended to the last product from the member. So to say there's a violation of the non-discrimination principle in terms of Article 1, in terms of the MFA, you have to identify which of those elements are being not like. እነዚህን ኤሌመንቶች ተመልክተን ነው it's okay, there is a violation, there is no violation, there is indeed a violation of the non-discrimination condition. Advantage አለ ወይ? ፕሮዳክቶቹ ላይ ፕሮዳክቶች ናቸው ወይ? ለሌላ ሀገር ተሰጥቷል፣ ለማንኛውም ሀገር ተሰጠ ነው ወይ? ኮንዲሽን አታች ተደርጎበታል አልተደረገበትም የሚሉትን ተመልክተን ነው። በኋላ the products are not like products. ስለዚህ we don't talk about discrimination እንችላለን. Or maybe you have accepted the privilege, the advantage, but you've attached the condition. እሺ ለዚህ የሰጠሁት 20% ታሪፍ for coffee would extend to you B, provided you explicit in the negation ነው ለዚህ የሰጠሁት privilege ለእናንተ extend ማድረገው ምን ሆኖ attaching to a condition. The products are like products. There is a benefit or an advantage given to one, but you are attaching the condition to that. So you can say there is a violation of the Article 1. Article 1 amendment. Any questions? All clear? Okay, then we'll continue next week on the second aspect of the non-discrimination.